I don't think I'll ever forget that night. No matter how hard I try to push it out of my mind, it keeps creeping back, especially when it's late and I'm alone. It was a Thursday, just like any other, but what happened changed everything. I'd spent most of the evening in the library, cramming for an exam. By the time I got back to my dorm, it was already past midnight. Emily, my roommate, wasn't there, but that wasn't unusual. She had a pretty active social life, always out with friends or studying somewhere else on campus. Her bed was perfectly made, and her umbrella was leaning by the door. I thought maybe she'd just stepped out for a while or crashed at a friend's place. I didn't think much of it. I showered quickly, locked the door, and climbed into bed. Before I fell asleep, I sent her a text. "Hey, you good? Didn't see you earlier." I figured she'd respond in the morning, like always. At around 3 o'clock, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard this faint shuffling sound, like someone moving around in the room. It wasn't loud, just subtle enough to put me on edge. I turned my head toward the noise, squinting into the dark. The shadows in the room felt heavier than usual, and for a second, I thought I saw someone standing near the closet. My heart skipped a beat. "Emily? Is that you?" I whispered, my voice shaky. Nothing. Just silence. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was the wind outside or someone in the hallway. The noise stopped, and after a few minutes of staring into the dark, I pulled the covers up to my chin and tried to calm down. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to banging on my door. At first, I thought it was my Ra doing one of her random check-ins, but when I opened the door, 2 police officers were standing there. Behind them, I could see other officers going in and out of rooms down the hall. "Are you Rachel Harper?" one of them asked. I nodded, my stomach tightening. "Yes." "What's going on?" "Your roommate, Emily, has been reported missing," the officer said. "Her family hasn't been able to reach her since yesterday afternoon." Missing. The word hit me like a brick. I felt like I was in a fog as I stepped aside to let them into the room. I kept trying to piece it together in my head. Missing? Emily couldn't be missing. She probably just forgot to check her phone. Maybe she stayed out late and didn't tell anyone. But then the officers started looking around, really looking. They weren't just glancing around the room, they were moving things, checking under furniture. One officer knelt by my bed, and when he leaned back, his face went pale. "Ma'am," he said, motioning for another officer to come over. "We've got something." I leaned forward to see what he'd found. There were faint streaks of something dark blood smudged under my bed. My breath caught in my throat. They kept searching, moving to the closet. One officer pulled back Emily's clothes, revealing scratches along the wall. Deep, jagged marks, like someone had been clawing at it. My knees buckled. I had to sit down. "Rachel," one of them said gently, "did you hear anything unusual last night?" I told them about the shuffling noise, about how I thought it was Emily, about how I'd called out but heard nothing. They exchanged glances, the kind of look that makes you feel like they're not telling you everything. "Rachel, it's possible that whoever was in this room last night was still here while you were sleeping," the officer said. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Someone had been in here while I was asleep. As the investigation went on, the police pieced together a horrifying picture. Emily had likely been attacked right there in our dorm room. The blood smears and signs of a struggle confirmed it. They believed she'd been dragged out through the window, our third-floor window, and taken somewhere. They searched everywhere but found no sign of her. Emily's earring was found under my bed. The realization that it had been there the whole time, just a few feet from where I slept, made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. That shuffling noise. The shadow I thought I saw. Was it Emily? Or was it someone else? Someone who had been watching me as I lay there, completely unaware. I couldn't stay in that room. I packed up my things and moved out the next day. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the fear. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that shuffling noise. Every creak of a floorboard or whisper of wind feels like someone's there, just out of sight. Emily was never found. The police eventually gave up, but I haven't. Sometimes I wonder if she's still out there somewhere, alive. Other times, I wonder if she's closer than I think, if the person who took her might come back for me. Because late at night, in the dark, when everything is still, I can't help but feel it. That weight in the air, like I'm being watched. I've always thought of my apartment as a sanctuary, my little corner of peace in a bustling city. But in 2017, something happened that shattered that illusion, leaving me with scars I'll carry for the rest of my life. It started with small things you'd brush off if you weren't paying attention. Food seemed to vanish from my pantry. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. Maybe I'd eaten that last yogurt and didn't remember. Maybe I miscounted how much rice was left in the bag. But then it got stranger. I'd come home to find the fridge door slightly ajar, or cupboards left open when I knew I'd closed them. One night, I returned to my apartment and found my shower still wet. I live alone. No one else had a key. I told myself it was nothing. Stress, maybe, or some kind of silly mistake. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started to feel uneasy in my own home, as if I were being watched. I'd catch myself glancing at shadows or feeling a prickle on the back of my neck. The air felt heavy, somehow. Then came the night I decided to set up a camera. I placed it in the kitchen, pointing toward the pantry. It felt ridiculous at the time, like something you'd do if you thought your cat was knocking things over while you slept. But I needed answers. The next day, I sat down to review the footage. At first, there was nothing. Just the stillness of my empty apartment, the refrigerator humming quietly in the background. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, my anxiety growing with every uneventful frame. And then I saw it. The attic hatch, barely visible in the corner of the screen, moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it slid open. My heart pounded as I watched a hand emerge, thin and pale, gripping the edge of the opening. Then a face appeared. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and a strange, frozen expression that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't hesitate. She climbed down with eerie confidence, like she'd done it 100 times before. I sat frozen as the woman moved through my kitchen. She opened the fridge, rummaged through my food, and drank milk straight from the carton. But it wasn't just her actions that terrified me. It was how comfortable she seemed, how at home she looked. At one point, she paused and turned directly toward the camera, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was sit there, trembling. The footage ended with her slipping back into the attic just before dawn, as if she'd never been there. I called the police immediately. I don't remember much about that conversation, just that my voice was shaking so badly they had to ask me to repeat myself. When they arrived, they searched the apartment thoroughly. One officer climbed into the attic while I waited downstairs, clutching my phone like it could protect me. When they brought her down, I couldn't even look at her. She was gaunt, filthy, and reeked of sweat and decay. She didn't fight them, didn't scream. She just stared at me, her lips twitching like she wanted to say something. In the attic, they found a makeshift bed, a blanket that I didn't recognize, empty food wrappers, and things. Personal things. A hairbrush I'd lost weeks ago. A scarf I thought I'd misplaced. There was even a photograph of me, one I'd taken with friends and left on the fridge. She had scrawled something across it, but the ink was smudged. Later, when the police questioned her, she said she'd been living there for months, slipping down only when I was asleep or at work. She claimed she'd chosen my apartment because it felt safe, but the way she said it, with that strange smile, made my skin crawl. She also muttered something else, something that still keeps me up at night. "You invited me in." I moved out the next week, but the nightmare hasn't ended. I still wake up in cold sweats, convinced I hear faint creaks or whispers in the darkness. Even now, in my new apartment, I feel the same heavy presence, like I'm not alone. And every time I pass by the attic hatch, I can't help but glance up, half expecting to see it sliding open again. The police say she's locked away, that she can't hurt me anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, did she really live there just to survive? Or was there something else she wanted? Something she still wants? Let me tell you about the time I visited the Whaley House in San Diego. It was 2005, and my husband and I were on vacation, exploring the city. I'd always had a fascination with ghost stories, so when I heard about the Whaley House, one of the most haunted places in America, I insisted we check it out. My husband wasn't thrilled. He's the skeptic in our relationship, but he humored me, rolling his eyes at every mention of the supernatural. The house was impressive, but it had an unsettling presence. It's this old, weathered building from the 1850s, with creaky floors and dim lighting that seemed to soak up the California sun instead of reflecting it. The tour guide was full of stories, tragic deaths, hangings, unexplained footsteps in the night. I was soaking it all in, my husband. Not so much. The tour began in the parlor, where the guide talked about Thomas Whaley, the man who built the house. He described how the property had been plagued by tragedy, a botched hanging that left a man, Yankee Jim, strangling slowly to death before the house was even built. And then there was the Whaley family itself, burdened by sickness, financial ruin, and the deaths of several children. I took photos of everything: the ornate furniture, the dusty mirrors, even the faintly cracked walls. But there was something about the atmosphere that made me shiver. I can't explain it. It was as if the house wasn't just old, it was watching us, judging. When we reached the upstairs bedrooms, the guide mentioned that visitors often heard strange sounds: crying, laughter, whispers when no one was around. I remember standing in the doorway of one of the rooms, taking a picture of a rocking chair. I could have sworn it moved slightly, just a nudge. I didn't say anything though. I didn't want to seem ridiculous. Then we got to the courtroom on the ground floor. It was stark, with rows of wooden benches and a judge's desk at the front. The guide talked about how the room had been used for trials and even amateur performances. But I wasn't paying much attention. I was too focused on the strange feeling that hit me as soon as I stepped inside. The air felt heavy, oppressive. I wandered to the back row and took a picture. I remember the click of the camera and the faint chill that ran through me, like a draft had passed by. I glanced around but didn't see anything unusual, so I brushed it off. My husband was leaning against the wall, bored out of his mind, and I decided to take one last photo before we moved on. That night, back at our hotel, I sat on the bed scrolling through the photos on my camera. Most of them were normal old furniture, faded wallpaper, a lot of dust and shadows. But then I got to the pictures from the courtroom, and that's when I froze. There, in the back row of benches, was a man. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a dark suit, sitting casually as if he belonged there. His face, it wasn't right. Pale, blurry, almost featureless, but the shape of him was clear. I could see the folds in his jacket, the tilt of his head. He looked so real. My heart raced. I knew no one had been sitting there when I took the picture. The courtroom was empty, completely empty. I showed the photo to my husband. He frowned, squinting at the screen. "Did you Photoshop this?" he asked. I shook my head, too stunned to say much. He didn't have an explanation, and for the first time on this trip, he looked genuinely unnerved. The next day, I couldn't stop myself from going back to the Whaley house. I showed the photo to the tour guide, and I'll never forget the look on his face. He went pale, like all the blood had drained from him. "That looks like Thomas Whaley," he said after a long pause. "People have seen him before, usually in the courtroom. He likes to sit in the back." Hearing that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made everything worse. The man in the photo wasn't just some random shadow or trick of the light. He was there, watching, and I'd felt him, hadn't I? That draft, that heaviness in the air, it wasn't my imagination. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The camera I'd used to take the photos started acting strange. It would turn off randomly, or refuse to turn on at all. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of faint footsteps or feel that same oppressive weight, like someone was standing over me. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was just spooked from the experience. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The Whaley House wasn't just a historical landmark or a tourist attraction. It was alive in a way I still can't fully explain. Even now, all these years later, I can't bring myself to look at that photo for too long. I don't need to. I can still see him in my mind sitting there in the back row, calm and still, as if waiting for the next trial to begin. Or maybe just waiting for someone like me to notice him. And I did. God help me, I did. I've always thought of myself as a careful traveler. I'm the type who double-checks door locks, avoids dark parking lots, and chooses well-lit hotels in safe areas. But no amount of preparation could have prepared me for what happened that night in Las Vegas. It was a business trip. Nothing out of the ordinary. Meetings all day, polite small talk, and a long dinner with colleagues. By the time I got back to my hotel room, I was exhausted. It was late, past midnight, and all I wanted to do was crawl into bed and sleep. I remember the room being quiet, eerily quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioning. The city lights outside cast faint patterns on the walls, and for a moment, I let myself relax. I changed into pajamas, checked that the door was locked, and climbed into bed. Everything felt normal, safe, until the knock. It was loud, startling, even, and it jolted me awake. I looked at the clock, 1 o'clock. My first thought was that someone had the wrong room, but then I heard a man's voice on the other side of the door. "Maintenance," he said. "Ma'am, there's an issue with the water pipes. We need to check your room." His tone was calm, professional, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I hadn't noticed any problems with the water, and I hadn't received a call from the front desk about maintenance work. Still, I got out of bed and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, I saw him, a man in a maintenance uniform, holding a toolbox. He looked ordinary enough, but there was something in the way he stood, something about his expression. It wasn't friendly. It was blank, almost cold. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called out, "Hold on," and grabbed my phone. My gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. I dialed the front desk, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, there's a maintenance worker outside my room saying there's an issue with the water pipes. Can you confirm this?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the receptionist's voice changed, calm but sharp, like she didn't want to alarm me. "Ma'am, we haven't dispatched any maintenance workers tonight. Please stay in your room and lock the door. I'm sending security right now." My hands started shaking. I hung up the phone and backed away from the door, my heart pounding. The man was still standing there. Through the peephole, I could see his shadow shifting slightly, like he was waiting for me to unlock the door. A few agonizing minutes passed before I heard the sound of voices in the hallway. Hotel security had arrived. When I looked through the peephole again, the man was gone. I opened the door cautiously, letting the security team inside. They began checking the area, and that's when they found his toolbox, hidden behind a nearby potted plant. But it wasn't just tools. Inside were duct tape, zip ties, a knife, and rope. I felt sick. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the wall to steady myself. If I'd opened that door, I couldn't even finish the thought. The police were called, and I spent the next few hours recounting everything that had happened. I learned from the officers that similar incidents had been reported at nearby hotels. The victims were always women traveling alone, lured into opening their doors late at night by someone posing as staff. Some of those women had been abducted. Others were still missing. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I'd opened the door without calling the front desk, I could have been one of them. I couldn't stay in that hotel. I packed my bags and left that night, driving to another hotel across town. Even there, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the hum of the air conditioner made me jump. I think about that night often, about how close I came to disaster. I share my story with friends, family, and colleagues because I want them to know how important it is to trust their instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. I've also become more outspoken about hotel security. Things like clearer staff identification, better communication with guests, and stricter access to hotel floors could make a huge difference. As for the man outside my door, he was never caught. But the image of him standing there, calm and patient, waiting for me to unlock the door, still haunts me. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of that knock, or the weight of what could have happened if I'd made the wrong decision. Sometimes, it's the smallest choices that end up saving your life. Let me take you back to February 2006, to the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains in Soviet Russia. 9 young hikers, students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out on an expedition that should have been challenging but routine for their skill level. They were experienced truckers, strong, resilient, and prepared for the brutal winter conditions. Their goal was to reach a remote mountain called Otorten, which translates from the local Mansi language to "don't go there." It sounds ominous now, doesn't it? But at the time, it was just another adventure for the group, led by Igor Dyatlov. They carried diaries and cameras, documenting every step of their journey. The photos show them laughing, building snow shelters, and braving the harsh cold with determination. They were full of life. But less than 2 weeks later, all 9 of them would be dead. Their story remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of modern history. When the group didn't return on February 12 as planned, search parties were sent into the mountains. It wasn't until February 26 that rescuers stumbled upon their campsite on the slopes of Koletsakul, Dead Mountain in the Mansi language. The scene was baffling. Their tent, half buried in snow, had been slashed open from the inside, as though they were desperate to escape something. Inside, their belongings were neatly arranged: boots, warm clothing, even their food supplies left behind in the freezing temperatures. Outside, barefoot tracks led away from the tent, disappearing into the forest. It was as if they had run for their lives. But from what? And why abandon their shoes and coats in sub-zero conditions? The search teams found the hikers' bodies over the next several weeks. The first 2 were discovered at the edge of the forest, near a charred patch of ground where they had attempted to light a fire. Both were wearing only underwear, their skin blue with frostbite. It looked like they had died from exposure. But why had they fled the tent in such a state? 3 more bodies were found lying face down in the snow between the forest and the campsite, as if trying to crawl back to safety. Again, they were underdressed for the cold, but there were no visible injuries, just the quiet, horrifying stillness of frozen death. Months later, in May, the remaining 4 hikers were discovered in a ravine further from the campsite. Unlike the others, their deaths were far more gruesome. One had a fractured skull. Another's chest was crushed with a force so immense it was likened to a car accident. A female hiker was missing her tongue and eyes. And yet, there were no external wounds to explain these injuries. To make things even stranger, some of their clothing tested positive for radiation. Radiation. In the middle of nowhere. Over the years, countless theories have been proposed to explain what happened at Dyatlov Pass. An avalanche is the most popular explanation, with the idea that the hikers panicked and fled their tent in the middle of the night. But that theory doesn't account for the severe internal injuries, the missing tongue, or the radiation. Some believe the group stumbled into a secret Soviet military experiment, maybe a missile test or some kind of weapon that caused disorientation and trauma. Others point to the possibility of infrasound low-frequency vibrations caused by wind that can trigger panic and paranoia in humans. And then there are the wilder theories: UFOs, Yetis, or supernatural forces. These explanations may seem far-fetched, but when faced with a mystery this bizarre, even the implausible feels worth considering. Here's the thing. None of the theories fully explain everything. Why did the hikers slash their tent open from the inside? What caused such immense internal injuries without leaving external wounds? Where did the radiation come from? And why did they flee their shelter barefoot, into certain death, as though they were running from something unimaginable? Even now, decades later, the Dyatlov Pass mystery captures the imagination of investigators, conspiracy theorists, and adventurers. In 2020, a Russian investigation revisited the case, concluding that a slab avalanche caused the deaths. But for many, including me, That explanation feels too neat, too dismissive of the eerie details that make this case so compelling. The Dyatlov Pass isn't just a place where 9 hikers met their end. It's a haunting reminder of how little we understand about the world around us. It's the kind of story that stays with you, not because of what we know, but because of what restricts asterisks.